Simon, I know we've done some research recently on who foots the bill when it comes to regulatory non-conformance and when regulators get involved and issue penalties.
Yeah, and it's interesting because the regulators are focused on the data owner. So we've got the data owner and the data processor. And when we look at the data owner, the customer, typically they will have handed over their responsibility in their minds to the managed service provider. And the managed service provider will say, well, I'm just transporting data from point A to point B. Unfortunately, the regulator has now decided that they are both part of this chain of trust because they both have a requirement to secure that data or they own the data in the first place. So in the research we've done recently, we've seen there's about a 50-50 split between who's responsible for any data breach that happens, and that translates into 50% of the fines. And the fines that we know can be pretty horrendous, around 4% of global group revenue per data breach if it's something like a GDPR type breach, and it varies for different types of breach. But as we've seen with things like Meta, because of their global group revenues, that equated to $1.3 billion for one data breach. So not inconsiderable amounts of money.
So when we consider that MSPs work on the premise that they will deliver services across a number of customers, when you really accumulate the risk that's being carried per customer across multiple customers, all of a sudden this can be a very big economic risk problem for MSPs.
Yeah, it's huge. If you looked at it purely on revenue and risk, their business would be non-viable because they're taking a percentage risk for every single customer. Now they typically will have looked at their terms and conditions and put in that they're not responsible for any data breach. Unfortunately, that doesn't carry any weight with the regulators because there's still the European laws that they have to comply with that overtake any of their terms and conditions. So they may well have said to the customer, I'm absolving myself of any responsibility, but they're still responsible for 50% of any fines that result from a data breach. So we need to find a way of mitigating their risk and protecting the customer's data at the same time. And that's where Certes comes in by wrapping that security around the customer's data so that the service provider doesn't have to worry or add their own security on top. They're purely providing the service of that connectivity element that they've done for many, many years quite successfully. The risk is put back 100% with the customer who's in control of their data, in control of protecting it and making sure that the regulators can't levy any fines because the data itself is protected, not the infrastructure it's travelling over.
But we've seen encryption as a technology has been around for years. So one of the things that we're all aware of is that actually when you do encryption on a large scale, there are performance issues, there are visibility issues. So how do we make sure that the service providers can deliver their services but without impacting the ability to deliver other value to customers as well?
Yeah, so the unique capability that Certes brings to the market is the ability just to protect that data payload, that data component of the network packet that's travelling along, which means all of the other information that the traditional managed service provider would use for reporting, monitoring, accounting, auditing is still visible to them. So as you said, with traditional encryption, it's just a blanket encryption. Everything else gets obliterated. You can't see what it is, where it's come from, where it's going to, etc. With Certes in the solution, we protect just that data element and everything else is still in the clear as it was previously. So all the reporting works, the monitoring, the analytics, it all continues on as it did before.
Yeah, when we're talking to customers and service providers, there's really three key areas that they're looking to drive, and that's either financial cost savings, efficiencies, or people related. And the fact that we can overlay any network infrastructure without having to change that underlying infrastructure from a configuration perspective means that from a financial perspective it makes sense. From an efficiency perspective it makes huge sense because they're not having to make huge configuration changes to the underlying network infrastructure, and they're able to redeploy those people, keep those people deployed in actually managing the service from an SLA perspective rather than having to configure complex and heavy encryption type strategies.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point because we are transparent to the existing network infrastructure that's in place. So this is seen as a business risk mitigation solution rather than a wholesale re-architecting of their network to fix a network security problem. So it's a very simple way for an organisation to protect themselves and protect their customers' data.